Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. We have a panelist which is spanning all over from the US all the way down to Singapore. It's a new dawn in the US with the election results coming out, and it has implications on Indo-Pacific region and more important on US-India relationship. We have assembled a very strong group of panelists who will talk about in the next hour regarding Indo-Pacific region and the US and specifically India itself. We have Mr. Vijay Gokhale, who is the non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie, India. And Mr. Gokhale retired from Indian Foreign Service in January 2020 after a career of almost 39 years as the Foreign Secretary. And I've had the pleasure of working with Mr. Gokhale for many years, and you'll find his comment quite insightful, especially on the Indo-Pacific region. We do have Professor C. Raja Mohan. He's the Director, Institute of South Asian Studies. Earlier, Professor Mohan was Professor of South Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies and Nanyang Technology University, Singapore. We have Nidya, who brings a tremendous experience in international affairs and international trade issues in Asia Pacific. And her majority of her career has been with the Bauer Group, and she will be representing, speaking from Singapore. So welcome to the panel. And finally, we have James Crabtree. He's a Singapore-based author and journalist and associate professor of practice at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So welcome, and over to you, Ambassador Wisner, to moderate the session.
Mukesh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning and to join such a distinguished panel. We have had quite a weekend in the United States. The election took place on the 3rd of November, and it took us till the 7th to come up with a decisive conclusion. And now Joe Biden, Kamala Harris are the president and vice presidents-elect. The coming weeks are going to be highly charged as the pair of them deal with a very fraught transition post-Trump of addressing COVID. And already we have the announcement of a task force of dealing with the economy and the stimulus required to keep it moving, and signaling that the United States is going to re-enter the international system as a committed and respectful participant. While it's absolutely certain in my mind that the United States agenda, President-elect's agenda, will be dominated by domestic issues, certainly for the early months of his administration, make no mistake about it, Joe Biden will be a foreign policy president. But he will bring several features to the conduct of American foreign policy that are worth all of us keeping in mind. First and foremost, you can expect a change in tone, a more respectful, a more nuanced tone of discourse than we've been used to in the past 4 years. We can also expect less seat of the pants decision-making, more deliberative processes, greater consultation in foreign policy with Capitol Hill. Biden will move to reestablish our relationships with our European and Asian allies, and I think you will see the emergence of a greater clarity of strategy towards those of our adversaries, notably China and Russia. Biden will move decisively to reconnect the United States with international institutions and the rule-based order. He'll be back in the WTO, the WHO. He will move to put the United States in due course back in the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran. But he will not be an original president, turning to global issues. In particular, you will see a fresh emphasis on arms control, on cyber and space, but most of all, mark my words, he will put his stamp on climate change and expect us to be back in the Paris Agreement in fairly short order. Finally, I would underscore that President Biden will put fresh emphasis on the promotion of democracy and human rights, but it will be in a more carefully articulated and nuanced manner, without complicating the broader objectives and the limited power that the United States can bring to bear. As we look to your region, the Indo-Pacific, it is easy for me to remark that the United States has been a Pacific power since 1945. We've fought wars, we've created alliances, and we've built an extraordinary economic relationship with the Indo-Pacific. But now we face a major challenge, and that is the rise of China and the necessity to manage our relations with China. The second important feature, to my mind, is the rise of India as a serious factor in America's views of the Indo-Pacific, a term that has come into play during the latter days of the Obama administration and now fully reflects the way that President Trump played it out. And I am certain, absolutely confident, that Biden will continue to think in terms of the broader definition of the region. The relationship with India has continued steadily to grow since the late 1990s, and the most recent, the trip of Trump in February 2020, and the recent 2+2, the Comprehensive Global Strategic Partnership, begins to define the contours, the objectives in practical terms at official levels of the relationship. With China, Biden, however, will move in a more strategic direction. Count on him to continue to confront China when it oversteps, to compete with China, particularly in combination with allies, but also to seek ways to cooperate where we can. The role of the Quad, a relatively new geopolitical institution, is emerged and will continue to be very much on the Biden agenda. With those scene-setting remarks, let me turn to two of my colleagues. First of all, Rodney Slater. Rodney, who's observed this election, was our Secretary of Transportation, observed this election at firsthand, may want to expand on the politics of it. And Frank Simolis, given the critical role of trade in our relationships with the Indo-Pacific. I'll turn to you next. Rodney, if you could give us a couple of minutes, and then Frank. Rodney, you're muted. Good.
What about now?
You're fine.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Wisner. And I appreciate the opportunity to join you and our colleague, Frank Simolis, and everyone else on this call to talk about the important change that has occurred, that's underway in the U.S. when it comes to our political leadership, but also the ongoing relationship of the U.S. With the Pacific region, and especially, India, Singapore, many of the countries that you have that you've mentioned in your remarks, China in particular. I'm excited about the opportunity to reconnect, as you have emphasized. And from a transportation perspective, you and I have had many conversations about the importance of aviation in that regard. During my tenure as secretary, we actually entered a number of bilateral aviation open sky agreements with countries across the globe, but especially in the Pacific region. And I do believe that there is an opportunity to continue to work to enhance those relations. We used to talk about the business of transportation being the business that helps other businesses do business. And clearly one of those important businesses is tourism, but beyond that, all other businesses and connections made possible through transportation and our ability to communicate. And so I'm very excited about the ability to build on that, clearly the ability to go beyond what currently exists to enhance relations. And I think that President Biden, along with his Vice President Kamala Harris, who clearly has a history with the region, I think that that's something to underscore as well, because not only is she the first woman, but a woman of color with family relations that connect her to the region, to India, and also her family connections from Jamaica and the Caribbean region. And we're excited about the insight that she can bring personally to underscoring the importance of connections between the U.S. and these regions of the globe. So I'm looking forward to that as well. I'll close with this, and I think it's the most significant statement that's being expressed by the president-elect and the members of his team that will become known to a greater extent over the next couple of weeks, and that is the willingness to extend a hand rather than, frankly, to extend either a stiff arm or a fist or however we might characterize it. The willingness to be vulnerable in your power dynamic, meaning being open to the opinions and the interests of others as you forcefully express your own opinions and interests. I believe that we are strong enough as a nation to do that. And I think that this moment requires that. The vice president also said during his many expressions and speeches over the course of the campaign that history often requires of us more than we can anticipate or expect. And when history calls, we have to be ready to step into that moment to deal with the challenges at hand with the hope of an outcome that can take us forward, not only as a nation, but in our relations with our partners. I think that that is the kind of visionary leadership that we can expect from this new administration, and I'm excited about it.
Rodney, thank you. Thanks, really, that's wonderful. Frank, economics undergirds our entire approach to the Indo-Pacific. What do you foresee on the trade and economic fronts?
Thank you, Mr. Mbak. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
you can.
Oh, great. Thank you for having me, Mukesh. And I agree with the overall comments of Ambassador Wisner and Secretary Slater. I think it's a bright new age for the United States, particularly with respect to trade policy. As Ambassador Wisner said, writ large on foreign policy, Biden's trade policy will be more strategic, more nuanced, less unpredictable, and going back to embracing multilateral institutions. From my point of view, it will be particularly the WTO, which is undergoing a race for a new director general. We know it will be a woman, one of two candidates. So I think there is a real opportunity for some significant change in the WTO. It's perfect timing for President Biden to engage in multilateral reform and hopefully begin multilateral negotiations. I don't think trade will be an immediate issue for the Biden administration, but he has hinted at some proposals that he will initiate. One in particular will be increased Buy American programs. That could pose some problems in terms of WTO compliance. We'll have to wait and see what the details are. An important point to consider is that the U.S. law extending trade promotion authority, which is the requirement to enter into bilateral regional agreements, expires July 1st. So Mr. Biden will be at the mercy of a Republican Senate, presumably, to extend that authority. That could have a hamper on conclusion of existing agreements. I don't think the pending bilaterals that Mr. Trump has initiated will be concluded by Mr. Biden anytime soon, assuming they go beyond the Trump administration. With respect to China, I think, again, it will be a more structured approach, similar to what the Obama administration had, possibly recreating the strategic and economic dialogue. Whether or not he removes the 232 tariffs and the 301 tariffs remains to be seen, but I think he will engage in negotiations to achieve some concessions for the elimination of those tariffs. And then finally, particularly for this audience and the Indo-Pacific region, I think Mr. Biden will dust off the Trans-Pacific Partnership and hopefully re-engage the United States in that very important regional agreement. The question is, and what I'd love to hear from the panelists and the speakers, is whether or not the existing TPP member countries would be willing to welcome back the United States. I think that provides an immediate institution that could be very effective in setting the rules on some issues that affect US-China trade, particularly things like state-owned enterprises. So that, in a nutshell, is my assessment of the Biden trade policy. I think it'll be, again, more multilateral, more engaged with our traditional allies, hopefully getting us more engaged in the WTO, hopefully getting us back into the TPP. With that, Mr. Ambassador and Mukesh, I turn it back to you.
Frank, thank you. Very helpful, setting the stage. I'm going to turn the questions to our very able panel. And Mr. Secretary, Mr. Gokhale, let me begin with you. The concept of the Indo-Pacific is more novel to the United States than I suspect it is to India. You've always seen yourself inside the context of an Asian community where your security and economic interests are deeply embedded. But I wonder how you see the next 5 years from India's point of view. What will be India's strategic objectives? How will India maintain that delicate balance between her historic search for strategic autonomy and the requirements of sharing within an institution like the Quad? How do you see the next 5 years? And do you see India fueling her participation in this undertaking with increased funding for her diplomacy, her intelligence services, and the modernization of her military? Let me throw that big ball to you and let you deal with it.
Thank you, Ambassador. And it's a great privilege and pleasure to be with all the other panelists on this event. Ambassador, obviously, our government has welcomed the election of President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris, and I have no doubt that they are already making an assessment of how this will play out for India, because there is an understanding that the President and Vice President-elect are somewhat constrained by a Republican-controlled Senate and also a narrower Democratic majority in the House. Now, I think there are positives to begin with, because both President-elect Biden and a number of his likely picks for the key positions will perhaps be known to the Indian leadership, to Prime Minister Modi, to External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, to a number of other members of the cabinet. And that should, to some extent, smoothen the process of Indo-US relations going forward. So the big question is, where does India and also where does the Indo-Pacific fit in the agenda of President-elect Biden when he has a plate full of problems? As you pointed out, there's the issue of the economy, there's the issue of COVID-19, and on the international front, repairing alliances with the alliance partners, dealing with Mexico and Canada, dealing with the Middle East and so on. So where does the Indo-Pacific fit into this? So far as India is concerned, I want to make 2 points. One, I think there is a greater orientation by the Modi government towards the sea, the maritime domain, as a fundamental basis for Indian foreign policy. So we've seen a decisive shift in his administration away from a land-based border to a maritime boundary, which encompasses a much larger number of states, spanning literally from the Gulf of Aden to the Straits of Malacca. The second thing is, we worked well with the Trump administration on this particular subject, both in bilateral relations on the defense and security side and in terms of the Indo-Pacific. There was a synergy between the Departments of State and Defense on the American side and the External Affairs and Defense Ministries on the Indian side. And as a result, we've seen the vision which our Prime Minister spoke of in 2018 in Singapore taking some shape. Now, this is a process which has just begun. And the ministerial level meetings which have been held, 2 of them, which are of course also backed by the 2+2 meetings, are sort of taking that process forward. But to my mind, we still haven't reached a concrete point of defining what the 4 countries of Quad might do, or what India and the United States might do in concrete terms to make the Indo-Pacific construct a sort of a platform for the region. Now here, the Biden administration's own position, and certainly that of the president-elect in his article in the Foreign Affairs in March and April 2020, didn't go into any great detail. So I think India would really look for 2 or 3 things. Firstly, they would look for an affirmation from the United States, from the Biden administration, that they are as committed to the Indo-Pacific idea and to Quad as the Trump administration was. Secondly, we would look to see if the United States and the other partners were willing to utilize a platform to deliver alternatives to the region in terms of infrastructure, in terms of investment, in terms of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and so on. In other words, something concrete beyond simply words and beyond simply gestures. And thirdly, we would look to see what the defense posture of the Biden presidency might look like in terms of defense spending, because we understand that in an economic crisis, defense appears to be an easy casualty. And in this situation where by 2030, the Chinese naval capabilities would be more than the size of the United States and India put together, is the Biden administration going to invest money in building up the Navy as one of the bulwarks of its Indo-Pacific strategy? So I leave it at that, Ambassador.
Foreign Secretary, let me push you though on one point. You made a very strong argument for clarity in American commitments, both in defense and economic terms. Let me push you back a bit on Indian commitments. India's likelihood to invest in the modernization of her armed forces, her diplomacy, her intelligence service, so that she's a strong partner in this process. There are huge demands, economic demands on the Indian government. How do you balance the importance of the Indo-Pacific and the domestic imperatives?
Yeah, so I think there's a very clear understanding in India that we can't go it alone. I think the need for partners is very clear to the Indian leadership. And my sense is that the foundational agreements that India has completed with the United States, the last of them having been signed just 2 weeks ago when Secretaries Pompeo and Esper were in India, is an indication of that. We've also done similar agreements recently with Australia and Japan. Now, I think there is a very clear understanding that because the maritime domain is the highest priority, that capital resources will be allocated to that area. It might be at the cost of other services, maybe the Army or the Air Force, but I have no doubt that this government in India sees the maritime domain in all its dimensions: coastal shipping, the ports, the Coast Guard, the Navy, the islands, of which we have 1,300, as a sort of integrated effort to bolster our maritime domain. So I don't think that the Biden presidency would have been left in any doubt of India's commitment and of following through on putting your money where your mouth is.
That's a good place for me to segue to Roger Mohan. Roger, there are few finer students of the balance of power than you. I've admired you for many years. So tell me for a moment, pick up there, what is the Quad? What can it be? Is it an alignment of interests? Is it an emerging diplomatic, political, and security partnership? What are its contours? What are its membership? I note that the French are now talking about playing. What are the limits? Where does Southeast Asia come in? What's this Quad really about? And where over the next 5 years do you see it developing?
Thanks. Thank you, Ambassador Wisner. Nice seeing you. And thank you, Mukesh, for inviting me for this. So I think the Quad is a response to a historic structural change that has taken place in Asia, East Asia, the Indo-Pacific, whichever nomenclature you prefer, that the US dominance of the post-war Asian order is being challenged today by China. That is the new reality. And it also comes after nearly 4 decades of expansive economic and security cooperation between US and China. That is, the peace between US and China, dating back to the 70s, has produced a context in Asia which seemed to have benefited everyone in the region. There's more integration, less great power conflict, more peace, and more prosperity. Now, that phase is quite clearly over, and we are into a new phase. And that's where the economic side of it, as well as the security side of it, come into being, and both are reflecting themselves in the way the Quad evolves. On the security side, I mean, it's quite clearly, if China's military gets dominant, as Ambassador Gokhale pointed out, what happens to the US security structures that were created to deal with the Soviet threat? Can they really respond to a Chinese dominance, especially since the US had actually promoted the region's cooperation with China for nearly 4 decades? So in some sense, that the security structures will have to, because already you're seeing long-standing US allies, Thailand, Philippines, South Korea, their attitude to US-China relationship and how the compromises or the pressures on them to behave differently, we're beginning to see. So some sense, I think the US is recognized, I think, that it needs to look beyond the traditional alliances to structure a wider framework while strengthening the existing alliances with Japan and Australia. Bringing India into this framework gives it greater depth and greater stability. And the Indo-Pacific is the definition of that expands, and the Quad is the expression of that institutional expression of that situation. So what began as a security thing, I think, in the wake of the pandemic, it's also become an economic issue. That is, the question of how much of economic decoupling that the US is prepared to do with the Chinese, because the pandemic has told us the dangers of over-reliance on China. And also the recognition that China has actually gained the WTO, the international trading system, to its unilateral advantage, and some rearrangement that needs to be made. And I think that has been reinforced by US domestic politics, where whether Trump or Biden, the mobilization of the working people in the US to believe that globalization has not benefited American people in the same way. Therefore, the need for some rearrangement of the global institutions, whether it is in terms of the global value chains, whether it is in terms of creating new technological coalitions, whether it's on 5G, whether it is on the new areas, the digital area that is emerging, that there's need for fresh coalitions to be built to be able to deal with a more stable, a more balanced structure, one that will incentivize better behavior by China. And I think the Quad's security and economic dimensions, I think, are aimed to producing a behavior, because in the end, neither US nor India nor anybody in Asia can live without a reasonable accommodation with China. But at this point, Chinese unilateralism has limited the opportunities for any reasonable engagement. And hopefully, if the Quad succeeds, you should be able to produce a reasonable framework in which the interests of the most countries can be taken care of. In this, I think for most of us, like Ambassador Gokhale pointed out, it's really what is the balance of forces within the United States on globalization, on industrial policy, on trade, Is it about WTO reform, or is it about a fundamental change in the structure? Is it about reinforcing American forward military presence, or is it strengthening the regional allies to produce some in situ balance of power? From outside, at least, it seemed the Trump administration had given one set of answers to these questions. What we don't know at this point is really what are the answers of the Biden administration. I don't think it's fair to ask them to produce those answers in the first 2 days. Hopefully, those answers will come. I think what India and the rest of Asia are looking for is clarity, that if there is clarity in the US intentions, economic and security domains, we'll adapt. We have no choice. If the US decides to go in a path X, the other powers have no choice but to adapt. But I think if there is confusion on where this is going, say if climate change is more important than balancing China, if accommodation of Chinese interests is more important than producing a stable balance, one set of outcomes follow for the others to follow through. While if the US says, look, they are going to do both in a finely balanced way, and that reassurance, I think the allies will deal with it in a different situation. So I think the rest of Asia, not just India, wants answers from Washington and the new team. Many of them we are familiar with. Question is, how is it going to frame this? I'm told there are two parts. One is a restoration of the Obama policies. Other is a significant modification that actually deals with the new realities on the ground. So we're really looking to see how the internal balance, because the US has become the variable in our politics here, and that the less it is a variable, the easier it is to deal with the new dynamic that's emerged.
Roger, I got your message. It's very clear. I think you're going to find more change in continuity, but continuity in the engagement of the United States than the query you put before us. But leave that to the side. Let me ask you a quick follow-up question about India. You've been a student of Indian foreign policy. India's always treasured her independence. She treasured her position in the non-aligned movement. She's fought to maintain her strategic autonomy. The Quad offers a rather different outcome. To what degree do you believe India will enter the Quad arrangements with a full-throated, full-hearted contribution, or will it also have its eye over its shoulder on maintaining strategic autonomy?
Hank, I think, you touched on issues which there's a general sense somehow the mantra defines India's policies rather than the objective circumstances that India confronts defines its policies. So it is not the other way around. But there is a kind of mythology that's been created somehow. India is going to be this mythical non-alignment, strategic autonomy, as if those are going to be the defining features. I mean, I'll just give you two examples of two different types. When faced with the US-China rapprochement in the 70s, India signed a security treaty with the Soviet Union. That was a straightforward balancing effort to what we saw was a hostile move in the region, and both US and China getting closer to Pakistan. In the context of liberation of Bangladesh, it was a circumstance in which India had to balance. And I think it did it. India also does alliances of a different kind with the smaller countries. India has had security treaties with Nepal, with Bhutan, and it's today returning to a policy of offering security assistance, security cooperation to weaker states in the Indian Ocean. So my sense is, if you put aside the mantra and say, look, what is India going to do? I think India is ready for partnerships in a much more open way than it has been in the past, because India's circumstances demand it. Second, that India is willing to do more for its neighbors. Now, doing more with the US does not mean abandoning our friends in the South. Our foreign minister talks about India as a southwestern power. That it is, I think, India is not going to simply abandon the goodwill it has in the non-aligned movement or the friends in the Indian Ocean. But at the same time, India needs the partnership of the US and the West and Japan and Australia to be able to structure a reasonable balance of power in Asia. So if we focus on the outcomes rather than the mythology, I think India's path is already quite clear in the last 6 years. I think the present government has shed much of the historic hesitations, and I think he's laid out a path which is ready to work with others. That does not mean India is going to sign on a dotted line. I think US has had enough of those who just merely follow you. I think the US needs partners who can take responsibility, who can share your burdens. And I think India will be a better partner for you than those who say, you take care of my security and I'll just trade with you. India is not in that position. So I think we will be a more valued partner for you than your traditional allies who are really free riders on the United States.
Roger, thank you. Jim Crabtree, let me pursue this line of argument about the Indo-Pacific a step or two with you. And I'm going to put you in a difficult position, but an important one. And that is, there is an emerging consensus, Roger and the Foreign Secretary have underscored it, about the need to produce a balance of power in Asia to offset the rise of Chinese power. Looking north from where you are in Singapore today, how is China going to react to this emerging sense of priority to the restoration of the balance of power? Will China accommodate herself to it? Will she resist it? How will she play her cards looking forward? And second, where does that leave Southeast Asia? Will you, in your region, in the Southeast Asian region, aim more towards joining the Quad or standing apart from the Quad and China? Where will Southeast Asia go? So how will China react, and how will Southeast Asia play her cards?
Very good question. So thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, fellow panelists. I think those are exactly the right questions to ask. So for the US-India relationship, then really what matters, as Raja and Ambassador Gokhale said, is, in a sense, the US strategic posture and its willingness to recognize its weakness in the region relative to China, and therefore its need to strike new kinds of relationships with its potential partners. And it's unclear to me the extent to which, in a sense, it has sort of sunk home how substantial the challenge of China is, and therefore the fact that the US needs a different kind of partnership with the sort of the anti-China coalition, as it were. But as you say, the other question is, how will China behave? Because although we put a lot of hope in the Quad, really the Quad only moves forward when China misbehaves. I mean, that's basically what happened in the last meeting, where I think it would have been unlikely under normal historical circumstances that all of the Quad partners, not least India, would have agreed to have a foreign secretaries meeting at a time of such kind of geopolitical tension. But because of the worsening relationship between India and China, then India has been much more willing to countenance sort of tweaking China's tail by doing these kind of things. And so that's new, and that's welcome for those who want to see this partnership develop. I mean, I think China's strategy will be to test these emerging kind of configurations, whether it's the Quad or the Quad Plus, or there's going to be an awful lot of these different groupings, the D10, I think instead of putting a lot of eggs into the Quad basket, then you'll see a lot of experimentation to see which of these different groupings are going to hold water. I think it's quite unlikely, for instance, that you're going to see the Quad emerging as the real way in which infrastructure competition emerges, for instance. That seems unlikely. But maybe there are some other sort of functions that the Quad can begin to take up. But I think you'll see a kind of growing mishmash of different trilaterals and sort of additions to the Quad. What will Southeast Asia do? I think Southeast Asia has the same, in a funny way, has the same fear that India has, which is one of not so much under Trump, the fear was either Mr. Trump would do some crazy deal with China and carve up the region, or he'd disappear entirely. and become a kind of full isolationist. And so those were both very kind of present dangers. Under Biden, I think neither of those are very likely anymore. I mean, Biden's much more engaged and he's much less likely to do things that are eccentric, but clearly the risk is one of distraction. So both, I mean, he arrives with an enormous plate of problems, both domestic and international, but also in a sense in the very character of the man. And I suspect people in this room, know him well. He's going to want to be engaged in any number of different issues simply because he knows them so well. So Russia in particular, rebuilding bridges with Europe, a whole range of stuff to do with the pandemic. And so being frank about this, relations with India and Southeast Asia sort of trickle down this list reasonably carefully and so reasonably quickly. And so I think that's more the anxiety that the people in the region want the United States to be constructively engaged, solving problems, and the risk is that doesn't end up happening. So we hope that it will. There are a number of, I think there's lots of positive things to be said about the potential re-engagement of the US, both in Southeast Asia and in South Asia. I think there will be more Quad cooperation. There'll definitely be more Indo-American military cooperation. Although I think the question that was raised about US naval investment in the region and whether or not it can deliver on some of the more sort of assertive targets, the 500 hull fleet, for instance, given the current fiscal environment. I think that's an exceptionally good question that the ambassador posed. I think really the big gap, though, I think there's lots of military cooperation that can go on because in a sense that's, the US has a very effective and very large military. The problem the US faces is more that its potential modes of cooperation are rather unbalanced. So it was interesting that Frank Samolis mentioned the TPP. In a sense, even talking about that brings to mind the fact that the US doesn't have a great agenda of economic cooperation, certainly nothing close to what China can offer at the moment. And so I think it's quite unlikely politically that the US could think about rejoining the TPP, but even if there were to be some kind of new language or new way of sort of making a move in that direction, that would be very welcome. And the other question, I suppose, is whether there's more of a geo-economic agenda. Raja has written about this in his columns, and whether a serious US crafted approach to the reshaping of supply chains can come to India's benefit, if you see what I mean, as opposed to this happening naturally. Is this something that the US can begin to shape with its allies, because that would bring a real economic dimension to partnerships both with India and with Southeast Asia as well. So anyway, those are some thoughts. I think much more so than India, Southeast Asia is inevitably going to try and pick neither one side nor the other. It has no kind of economic self-interest in trying to annoy the Chinese. It's much closer. And so Southeast Asia's predicament, I think, is much more troubling in an era of great power rivalry than those who know which side they're on.
Nidya, the stage has been set for you to come in on the economic side. While the shifts in power are occurring in the region, as a number of the speakers have pointed out, so are the economics changing. Do you want to look at this over the next 5 or so years? What kind of Asia? We've seen an Asia that was increasingly coming together, China, the United States, expansion of trade, prosperity, but we've seen in the last year, and COVID has emphasized it, a sundering of some of these ties. Where are we going to be in 5 years? Are we looking to return to integration? Are we looking to partial separation? What will be the dominant trends?
Thanks very much, Ambassador Wisner. And before I respond to your question, I just want to say thank you to the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, as well as Mr. Foreign Secretary and my distinguished panelists for inviting me here today. I think the next 5 years is, really very hard to predict what's going to happen. I don't think anyone could have predicted at the start of this year that we'd all be Zooming on this panel right now. And I want to just say that, having the opportunity to go last allows me the benefit of having heard what everyone has already said before. So all I can do is just, add on little bits and pieces, instead of, complaining that you guys all stole my talking points. But I just wanted to say, I think there are a lot of big expectations from the world when it comes to a Biden presidency. Everyone is very excited, and rightly so. And everyone is looking for a reset to relations. But I feel like we need to be a bit more, and I guess this might be the Singaporean in me, where I say we need to be a bit more pragmatic and realistic about what we can expect from the next couple of years. One of the things that was already mentioned before was, we have the presidency and we have the House, but whether or not the U.S. has the Senate, whether or not the Democrats have the Senate is still up in the air, and it could go to a point where it's 50-50, and then Vice President will have to cast the deciding vote. What that means is, of course, there might be a bit more leeway when it comes to foreign policy. But it would definitely be more difficult to pass domestic legislation. And I think when it comes to trade and economic relations, I think everyone is excited to look towards, having these piecemeal and opportunistic relationships really give way to more well-rounded strategic relationships that will take us through the next couple years. You talked about the next 5 years, and at this time, Biden might not even be the president when it comes to year 5. So that's something that we also need to take into account, right? I mean, hopefully that would be the case, but we don't know for sure given his age and, given how fractured we have seen the country being, especially throughout the course of these elections. And so when it comes to trade, I think, while we are definitely very hopeful for a radical reshift or change in relationships, I don't think that it's necessarily a reversion to pre-Trump era, or a direct continuation of what the Obama administration had started. In terms of multilateralism, we definitely do see that he will move towards that. It will definitely not have such a focus on bilateral relations as the Trump administration has done. There will definitely be a return to the World Trade Organization. But I also do want to flag that, the US has raised its objections towards, the appellate body in the WTO, resulting in, a destruction to a certain extent of the appellate body. And, while dispute mechanism still functions, that's been very much hampered by the fact that, they haven't been able to appoint anyone there in the appellate body. And this is something that, has started from the Obama period, which Trump was then more fervent about. So I think that while it's positive news to have the US be more engaged in the WTO, there are some areas that we need to take note of in that area as well. When it comes to the TPP, I would say that, there really is a difficult road ahead. I think people talk about the TPP, but they forget that it is now comprehensive and progressive and without the US. And so, as a former TPP negotiator for Singapore, this is an issue very near and dear to my heart. And I would say that, the road ahead is difficult because, for one, the countries that remained after the US left had to work very hard to restructure the agreement so that it was something that everyone could agree to without the US presence, especially when it was when there were provisions where USTR had fought 11 countries to agree. And then, once the US was out, we were like, oh, do we still need this? Well, it was just a US, initiative. It wasn't really something that we wanted, but the USTR negotiators were just so good at what they do. And so, now that we definitely want to see the US return to the TPP, but I would say that, or I secretly hope that we make things a bit hard for them. The other thing to note too is that, the Democrats have typically been more skeptical when it comes to trade agreements. Don't forget that only 28 Democrats in the House voted for the Trade Promotion Authority back in 2015. And so, with that coming up for expiry in July 21, we can definitely expect, a difficult road ahead for the US to come back, even though, that is desperately my hope that I would want to see the USTR return to that. I would say tied to that, though, is of course the US-India trade deal, and there was a lot of talk about how how both sides had hoped that an agreement could be struck just prior to the elections, and I think unfortunately this was not the case. And at the same time, I think with Biden coming on board, and with Democrats in the House, I would point out that, I think there would be greater pressure for India to cave on issues such as labor and environment, which were issues that, the US gave us a hard time for in the TPP as well. And so I feel like that the road to that agreement might be a bit harder, but I would say that we shouldn't lose hope that such an agreement would take place at some point. The other tied to that, though, I would point out, that there are, of course, different considerations in place when it comes to the trade deal and RCEP, which hopefully will be signed later this week as all the ASEAN nations meet. But in that regard, I do feel that the RCEP is an easier agreement in terms of the strength of the provision as compared to what a Biden-led US-India trade deal might entail. But of course, I understand that there were different considerations in place for why India had pulled out then out of RCEP last year. And then my last point would be on, just going back to China and tariffs, and hopefully looking at the removal of the 232 and 301 tariffs. I do think that Biden has never been particularly China friendly, and China knows it. But I feel like at least Biden is open to negotiation, and he's unlikely to whip out any surprises there. But it really remains to be seen whether or not he'll remove tariffs or lower tariffs, or maybe just focus tariffs only on China, but maybe less so on the other more strategic partners. That's something that could happen, and I hope that provided lots of food for thought, and happy to take any questions you might have.
Good, Nadia, well done. There's so many questions to be pursued, and we only have a few minutes. And I know, Ketan, that I've noticed a number of questions coming in from the audience. Do you have one or two you could put on the table that our panelists could answer?
Ambassador Wisner, I don't see any questions in the chat room.
Good, okay. In that case, let me come back, Nadia, to you for a moment. There is a real question. China has on the table a terrific program, broadly defined One Belt, One Road, to expand China's market opportunities from Europe all the way to China. Infrastructure development is a signature Chinese intervention. And yet the demands for infrastructure are huge, well beyond anything the Chinese offer. Leaving aside complaints about the terms of Chinese investment, what in your mind can the Quad or related parties do in combination to offer the region alternatives to dependence on Chinese capital for infrastructure development? What are the options?
I think that infrastructure is always going to be a key need for developing countries around the region. And I think the issue here is how these countries can come together to provide programs that would be useful for these countries without strings necessarily attached. I think, for instance, Singapore has come up with an Infrastructure Asia agency that looks to pair companies with opportunities. And I think more and more with the pandemic, we're starting to see also, startups that are looking to, and consultancies that are looking to do more of the same, where they match, opportunities to countries and to organizations. And I think that could be a particular way forward to kind of think outside the box and not be so political in terms of the aspects of such arrangements, because with this type of Belt and Road diplomacy, there's always that fear of what's in it for the other party, what are the strings that are tied to these types of aid. And I think, the pandemic is the best time to think about what are some of the out of the box options that folks can consider.
Good. I'm going to ask a final question. Raja Mohan, Mr. Secretary, take a look at a couple of real hotspots. We have still an overhang of the nuclear problem in Korea. We have pressures on the Taiwan front that are real and rising. We have an uncertain future switching to the West in Afghanistan. How will these dangerous spots on the Asian littoral affect the future of the Quad, our cooperation, and our ability to deal with China?
Maybe the Ambassador Gokhale, you want to go first? Okay, I mean, so I think the three issues that you have. On Afghanistan, look, India would love to see Americans fight till the last American, but that's not going to happen. So I think it's better in US interest to let a regional balance evolve. So there again, a clarity that, look, you help those who are willing to fight for a different future. Once you make those judgments, the rest of the region will adapt. But I think leaving there half in, half out, then I think makes things worse. And I think 20 years have gone by. It is a war that started 2 presidencies ago. So my sense is, I think we're getting used to the fact that the US would leave Afghanistan. Second, I think in the Korean Peninsula, I mean, I think at some point you have to get an in situ balance shaping the Korean Peninsula. And I think the pressures on the US, both from the left and the right and within the Korean Peninsula itself, will make your choices harder. So I would say strengthen South Korea to produce a local balance, which then can produce different outcomes. I would say the same thing on Taiwan. Help produce regional balances, and more interestingly and more importantly, support local nationalism. That US doesn't have to do everything. That local nationalists, Asian nationalists can do the heavy lifting if the US is willing to help them. So I would say create stronger partners in the region rather than trying to do everything yourself, but that quite clearly has become politically unsustainable within the United States.
Let me put in a
Jane,
brief
you want
word.
to add the final word?
Yes, just a brief word. I would agree with Raja on Afghanistan, Pakistan. I think there would be a little concern in India about what sort of a deal the United States would strike with Pakistan and whether the Biden administration would continue to support India on the issue of terrorism in the way that President Trump has. On China, I think it's clearer because President-elect Biden has been fairly clear on China in the campaign. I think our interests converge to a great deal in the Indo-Pacific, and I think there may be some change in optics in the way in which the Biden administration deals with China. But I think we'd still be in a better place in East Asia with the United States than in AFPAC.
My clock tells me, Mukesh, that we've hit the magic hour marker. And I believe you told me to stay carefully with that. Do you have a closing word?
Yes, I just want to say very strong opinions and great discussion. I just want to say thank you on behalf of USISPF and its board to Secretary Gokhale, Professor Raja Mohan, Nadia from Bauer Group. James, we enjoyed your book. So once again, looking for the second version. Thank you. And then Ambassador Wisner, as always, a great moderator. Good to have you, and thank you. And we will continue with this dialogue as the Biden administration progresses further. So thank you, and wish you a very good day and good evening to all of you.
Thank you, Mukesh.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Nadia.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night to all of you. Yeah.
Good night. Thank you, Ambassador.